of the church or its oneness is a deep-rooted theme that vividly runs throughout the Bible. Such a powerful prayer of Jesus Christ in John chapter 17, or from the writings of Apostle Paul, we see this beauty of the unity in the church. Also, Peter picks up the same thing, and he speaks about this in 1 Peter chapter 3, we can read. Ellen White stands on the same theological platform together with the biblical authors by saying that secret of unity is found in the equality of believers in Christ. Jesus, being the center of this oneness, draws together all kinds of people, and he draws them to himself. He blends them and allows them to mingle with each other and grow in unity, but not in uniformity. Many people, unfortunately, confuse unity with uniformity. Uniformity that is not realistic, and uniformity even is unhealthy. In other words, in another place, Ellen White addresses some challenging situations that need to be considered in the context of church unity, and she says, if one man takes his views of Bible truth without regard to the opinion of his brethren and justifies his course, alleging that he has a right to his own peculiar views and then presses them upon others, how can he be fulfilling the prayer of Christ? And if another and still another arises, each asserting his right to believe and talk what he pleases, without reference to the faith of the body, where will the harmony which existed between Christ and his Father, and which Christ prayed might exist among his brethren? Very good questions. Unfortunately, the history reveals that many people have rejected the means that he has ordained for the help, encouragement, and strength of the church. During the early years of Sabbatarian Adventists and later on the Seventh-day Adventist Church, there were several attacks from various groups of people and individuals trying to destroy the church and her unity. So how did the church react to these attacks? And what lessons can be drawn from these historical confrontations? Let me briefly remind you about the beginning of the Sabbatarian movement, when two parties arose. The first one was the Messenger Party, and their major allegations were directed against James White's leadership and Ellen White's prophetic ministry. We can speak a lot about them, but let me just mention that Ellen White received support of the work that they were doing, and this support came from the Lord in 1855. And she wrote, "The Messenger Party has arisen, yet we should bear it all patiently, for they will not injure the cause of God. Now they have left us as much as they would have injured it by their influence they had remained with us. There was no need to spend time and energy on the group because the Church of God should move straight forward, as though there were no such people in the world." Ellen White did not advocate giving a blind eye to the recent problem. On the contrary, her statements directed the Adventists to concentrate on the major. She declared the truth, the present truth, we must dwell upon it. And the Sabbatarian Adventists followed the counsel and devoted their energies to the proclamation of the present truth. Then the Marian party arose during 1860s. Their allegations were based on the same principles as the Messenger party. But at that time, the church was already established, so they have heavily resisted against the established church. Even more, they tried their best to destroy faith among the Seventh-day Adventists, faith in the prophetic ministry of Ellen White, that would eventually lead to the destruction of unity in the church. Uriah Smith had to produce an apologetic book to the works of this Marian party in 1868. The enthusiasm to fight against God's established church and his gift of prophecy slightly damaged again the church and her unity for a short time. But this did not destroy her. The church withstood the attacks as she was based on the biblical truth, while the Marian party just disappeared and faded away during mid-80s. It's interesting to note that Ellen White was not interested in confrontational arguments in defense of her prophetic ministry. She writes, "It has been against my principle to enter into controversy with anyone or to spend my time in vindicating myself against the attacks of those who do not hesitate to adopt any means to pervert the truth or to cast stigma upon those who stand in defense of the law of God. Nothing would please Satan as his followers better than to have me engaged in this work. From then, they would give me enough to keep me busy all the time, and thus my real work would be left undone. But this is not the work that the Lord has given me." You know, it is not an easy task to face a detractor who used to be a successful preacher, researcher, and writer, and who generously contributed to the cause of the church. And this detractor we are talking right now is Dudley Kenwright. His early faulty misunderstandings of the law and consequently the righteousness by faith theme, together with his other arguments, were fueled by the then legalistic approach of the church leadership. This led Kenwright from one extreme to another. He became an antinomianist, ultimately departed from the church just 1 year prior to the General Conference in Minneapolis in 1888. Kenwright could not see the matchless charms of Christ in Ellen White's writings, while she rejected the same law-centered Adventism as he did. Kenwright continued his allegations against the church and Ellen White with a pre-1888 view. His main objections against God's messenger were based on his misunderstanding of God's inspiration of a human agent. This model proposes infallibility because he used the mechanical or dictatorial model. And this model excludes any revisions, editorial help. It excludes borrowing material. And no wonder that Kenwright strongly opposed Ellen White's writings and claimed them faulty. He charged her with plagiarism and raised a long list of issues that would eventually become the seeds for future critics. There is another model of inspiration that is called the whole person model, which we can see from the Bible how biblical prophets were inspired. And Ellen White strongly supported this model She wrote, "The Bible is written by inspired men. God as a writer is not presented, but God has not put himself in words, in logic, in rhetoric, on trial in the Bible. The writers of the Bible were God's penmen, not his pen. Look at the different writers. It is not the words of the Bible that are inspired, but the men that were inspired. The words and thoughts received the impress of the individual mind. The divine mind is diffused. The divine mind and will is combined with the human mind and will. Thus, the utterance of the men are the word of God." The Kenwright's critical legacy left an enormous destructive impact on the church and its unity. His several anti-Adventist works have continually poisoned the minds of people, thus feeding and producing more modern critics. The deadly danger of a particular pride, of a theological or any other position, dissatisfaction with the leadership, seeming discovery of a new light along with the refusal to accept personal wrongs, easily lead people from having an ultra-legalistic approach to anti-nominalistic attitudes and tactics. So while Kenwright and his followers damaged the church from outside, there were some who tried to injure her from inside, while falling into another extreme by becoming super spiritual. By the end of the 19th century, being under the influence of the righteousness by faith emphasis and expecting an immediate approach of the latter rain, a number of Adventists turned to fanaticism. They were ignited by a popular young speaker by the name Bellinger. His messages called Adventists for their baptism of the Holy Spirit in order to gain victory over sin and receive power for witness and salvation from sickness. Bellinger's voice was chiefly accepted by S.S. Davis in Indiana Conference, and this led Davis to carry the cleansing message throughout the conference with highly emotional and loud experience and non-biblical theology of cleansing people from sin and its tendencies, and release them from the power of death, thus preparing them to be ready for translation. This holy flesh movement, with its extreme spirituality and without a strong biblical foundation, destroyed the unity of Indiana Conference. And it was ready to be spread to other conferences. Ellen White at the time was in Australia, and from Australia she wrote the following: "The truth of this time needs nothing of this kind in its work of converting souls. The bedlam of noise shocks the senses and perverts that which is, if conducted aright, might be a blessing. No encouragement," she wrote, "should be given to this kind of worship." And then later on, when she returned from Australia, she addressed the General Conference session in 1901 with even stronger words, that no human being on earth has holy flesh. It is impossibility, she said. Then she continued to address the fanaticism that once started and left unchecked is as hard to quench as a fire which has obtained hold of a building. Ellen White's message was accepted by Indiana Conference leadership, and they confessed their faults and resigned from their leadership positions, thus ending that fanatical movement. However, extremism in the church did not stop with that. Throughout the years, the church experienced a number of her own members and various groups of people who divorced themselves from the main body, being inclined to spreading various extreme views of religiosity and spirituality. For example, Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement is another breakaway organization that originated in Germany as the German Reform Movement during the World War I, when the Adventist leadership in Europe supported church members to serve in the military even on the Sabbaths. To oppose that action, a number of church members separated themselves from the Seventh-day Adventists in 1915, and this led the group to start their open and harsh protest against the church with a cruel spirit of criticism that grew up to become a lifelong battle against the Seventh-day Adventist Church. There have been many numerous attempts to unite the reformers with the church. One of those attempts was done by Daniels in 1920. But unfortunately, the reformers have taken the position that they have been called by God to further their movement, and that the Adventist Church has apostatized from the truth. With this self-righteous, arrogant spirit and brainwashing attitudes, they believe that they had the only that they are the only faithful followers of God who are called to work among the fallen Babylon. And the fallen Babylon, according to them, is the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It is remarkable to note that while accepting the writings of Ellen White, they do not see what she clearly stated regarding the church. When anyone arises, either among us or outside of us, who is burdened with a message which declares that the people of God are numbered with Babylon, and claims that the aloud cry is a call to come out of her, you may know that he is not bearing the message of truth. Receive him not, nor bid him Godspeed. For God has not spoken by him, neither has he given a message to him, but he has run before he was sent. While the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement is currently not a large organization and mostly exists in Europe and South America, they can be found in any place of the world. It's interesting to also that their belief system is mostly based on the booklet, Principles of Faith, and secondly, on the Bible. They believe in a concept that God is vengeful and he is ready to destroy anyone who is not in favor with him. Thus, God has rejected the whole Seventh-day Adventist Church, according to them, because the mistake done by the church leadership in Germany during World War I. Of course, no one denies the fact that there are many Seventh-day Adventists who are not fully converted and who can be compared to the tares from the parable of Jesus, Matthew chapter 13. However, Christ is not calling the wheat to remove the tares from the field so that the wheat may grow richer. He allows both grow together until the time of harvest. Another historical event, the last but not the least Splinter group I want to mention to you has originated with Victor Houteff, who became dissatisfied with the church's governing body and proclaimed himself a divine appointed messenger sent to correct the Adventist church and its leadership. It's kind of a repetition. The group was organized in 1929, and it has been called the Shepherd's Rod or the Davidian Seventh-day Adventist Church. Houteff started his running work by ruining work by preaching, teaching, and publishing against the church. He claimed that his doctrines are free from sin, free from error, because God used him as a prophet after Ellen White's death. Taking only this one statement from the shepherd's rod reveals the true picture of Hotef and his false teachings, because Ellen White never claimed to be free from error or sin. On the contrary, she wrote that in regard to infallibility, I never claim it. God alone is infallible. His word is true, and in him is no variableness or shadow of turning. The Adventist Church had made, again, several minor and major hearings with Hotef in order to convince him of his theological errors. But again, he took his direction, and he was following his direction steadfastly. The shepherds rod have been convinced that God called them again to special mission to evangelize the Seventh-day Adventist Church, in spite of the fact that they themselves have gone through rough road of being fragmented theologically and physically. The splitting started in 59, and it still continues. Many fractured subgroups exist today in the world, and these subgroups added more additional beliefs to their theological foundation. Several of their prophets, like Roden, Eliakim, brought to their midst a seeming spirit of vitality for the continuation of their purposes. At the same time, they added more confusion and non-biblical teachings to small Davidian groups here and there. It's interesting to know that this Davidian group especially penetrate the Seventh-day Adventist Church in those places where the resources are scarce, or proper discipleship and teaching is not done. The early church criticism and extremism were real historical developments that prepared the ground for future critics, various splinter groups, and numerous independent ministries. Whether they were the opponents of Ellen White's ministry and her writings, or those who misquoted and misinterpreted her writings, or those who selectively elevated them above the Bible to prove their own opinions. They all had one common characteristic. It's the spirit of criticism. And this goes together with selfish ambitions, pride, and unwillingness to submit to the fact that God is the one who established and leads the church and communicates to her through the spirit of prophecy. The willful ignorance of this drove many genius people out of the church to their misery of continuous disparagement, harsh criticism, and even to life of immorality and skepticism. So what this has to do with us today? Before I'm turning to my second part of the paper, I want to just mention that there are many, it's a lot of confusion in the church. Many people are scared because of these groups penetrating the church, and so they either try to avoid being united with any groups or inclined to any groups. At the same time, I want to mention to you that not these groups are bad in themselves. They're self-supporting and supporting ministries that the Seventh-day Adventist Church has been blessed with. These ministries have their biblically based origin, like the tent-making ministry of Paul, Or even like the early Sabbatarians, there was no organized Seventh-day Adventist Church at that time. These self-supporting or supporting ministries support God's work throughout the world. Their members faithfully donate their resources and themselves to where the main church is unable to contribute. Thus, these ministries could include any church-related ministry that may not be financially supported by the church. They're mostly found under the umbrella of ASI, which is a membership-based organization of lay people who actively participate in the church's worldwide mission. And throughout her writings, Ellen White continuously addressed and invited believers, especially young ones, to self-supporting work. For instance, calling people to missionary work. She writes, in many places, self-supporting missionaries can work successfully. Throughout the world, messengers of mercy are needed, and anyone can join this ministry. However, independent ministries or independent ministry groups are mostly composed of Adventists who desire to have purity of heart and godliness in their appearance and teachings, but have negative attitude towards the church and her leadership. Whedon summarizes this in two factors. First of all, the vast majority of these groups proclaim their loyalty to the formal denominational organization, as I mentioned. This, however, is usually followed with a careful listing of church's numerous faults and theological defects. And secondly, while affirming loyalty to the church, such organizations deliberately claim that the church is deficient both in doctrinal purity and ethical accomplishment. While there is no sense of listing independent ministries because their list can go large and it varies from place to place, it is important to mention a pattern that some independent ministries utilize in their operation. One of their characteristics is a strong emphasis on the spirit of prophecy, especially on the manuscripts and letters of Ellen White that may not easily be available to people, just to common people. Secondly, they may select a narrow list of topics and present their interpretation as historic truths or historic Adventism. Acceptance of this list becomes a test of salvation. These church members become honest students of a ready-made syllabus of do's and don'ts until they become discouraged in God's church and her mission. And these people replace their faith with a religion of works and newfound zeal that stands opposite to the clear biblical teachings. Thirdly, independent ministries often ask church members to give them their finances for operational needs. Thus, they lead church members away from being faithful to God and giving their tithes and offerings to the church. Fourthly, but not lastly, they often penetrate public universities where Adventist young people are studying. These young people are not yet deeply rooted in the truth, in the biblical truth, and therefore their faith experiences can either be crushed or they may become legalistic. Although there could be other patterns in the operation of independent groups, it is clear that their spirit, some forms of fanaticism and negative attitude towards biblical theology and church leadership may remind us of the earlier experience we just mentioned. To address these challenges, Reid suggests the following. Ours is a perilous age for Christians, not only from unbelief, but a willingness to believe too much. The false lies beside the true. The drives of human needs and the hype of marketing, both in products and ideas, push us to make the most crucial of decisions on shallow evidence. Christ has a better way. Careful searching of his word and placing utter trust in him alone. Offshoots. While members of various independent ministries stick to the church through their membership, there are others who divorce themselves from the Adventists and organize their own followers into a body that fearlessly attacks the church. These offshoots confront either the denomination leadership or any of the doctrinal statements or both. Historically known offshoots have been the two parties, the Shepherd's Rod or the Davidians, the Adventist Reform Movement, Robert Brinsmith's group, Desmond Ford, Walter Ray, Seventh-day Adventist Kinship International, and many others. In addition to them, such persons as Dale Ratzlaff and Dirk Anderson, with their supporters, have sown many seeds in the contemporary world. For example, Ratzlaff, he used to be an Adventist pastor for 13 years. He left the church because he could not fully understand the doctrine of the investigative judgment. Consequently, he refused to acknowledge other Christ-centered doctrine and the writings of Ellen White. Today, Ratzlaff leads a major campaign against the church, accusing Ellen White of being a false prophet. Dirk Anderson is another figure of offshoot campaign against the church and Ellen White. Again, being a former Adventist with a legalistic background, he works not only publicly through the printed pages, but also through the internet, confusing people in their search for information on Ellen White. And of course, Anderson has been heavily influenced by Dudley Kenwright writings. The common ingredient among many contemporary Adventist offshoots is that they have employed a word-oriented view of inspiration, similar to the Kenwright's view that discredits Ellen White writings and affects the biblically based doctrines of the church. Consequently, the followers of this interpretation become confused in their theological understanding, leave the church, and join other Christian denominations, or even become skeptics and atheists. Therefore, there is a great need to provide an adequate education among church members in regard to inspiration, revelation, and interpretation of both the Bible and Ellen White writings. So what? We can ask the question. You see, the spirit of this criticism and narcissism was born in a flawless environment of heaven by the most perfectly created being who stood next to Jesus Christ, Lucifer. This angel of light attacked God's leadership by criticizing the Creator and elevating himself in the eyes of the surrounding angels. He targeted the very heart of God, his character. As Ellen White puts it, this settled rebellion was incurable because the rebel gained his followers, and from that time it has been his special work to excite to rebellion all he can gain control over. This war in heaven was spread to the war on earth. Satan's attacks were directed against humanity in order to destroy it, but especially to devour the child who had to come. No wonder that Christ on earth was misunderstood, ridiculed, persecuted, and crucified. Although the Prince of Peace won the victory over the rebel and his angels, the Prince of Darkness continues his warlike attacks on those who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus. This group of believers follow the Lamb and obey his voice. And this agitates Satan even more. No wonder that he tries all the means in order to bring disunity and conflicts among God's children. Peter, envisioning the struggles the Church of God will have to go through prior to Christ's second coming, wrote that scoffers will come in last days. The attitude and the spirit of those who ridicule God's establishment on the earth and work against it have a pattern of the master rebel. They mar the character of God in his followers, and thus they attack God himself, because God is the main person under criticism. He is put under investigation by the unbelieving and egocentric humanity led by the angel of darkness himself. God's messenger calls the church not to marvel at this war and not to be discouraged. Although such rebellion will occur up to the time of the closing up of the work of the third angel's message, rebels will be purged out from among the loyal and true in due time. God's character of love will be vindicated, and his faithful followers will become victorious by withstanding the harshest attacks on the unity of faith and practice. And in conclusion, Christ's church has a tremendous task to accomplish on this earth, and this is to be united with Christ and his mission and purpose. Instead of following our own independent judgment, God's people are to be one in doctrine and in spirit. For he is calling the church to the unity of a character that will bear the test of trial. In order to avoid the great disappointment at Christ's second coming, each believer is to reconsider his or her walk with Jesus today and to give up all cherished views and opinions that stand against the unity of Christ and his body. Even more, Ellen White encourages the believers that at the very last moment, when the church will not only be criticized, but also persecuted for her faith and godly lifestyle, the true sheep will hear the true shepherd's voice. Self-denying efforts will be put forth to save the lost, and many who have strayed from the fold will come back to follow the great shepherd. The people of God will be drawn together and present to the enemy as united front. Therefore, my brethren, there is hope. But this hope must be based in Jesus Christ and his prayer that they all may be one, as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be one in us. John 17:21. Thank you.